After horrific attacks on mosques in New Zealand and church desecrations in France, how is the face of global terrorism changing? Foreign policy expert Dr. WALID PHARES returns with analysis. And later, are parents a little too involved in their adult children's lives? We'll talk to clinical psychologist and EWTN Radio host Dr. GUARENDI about parenting pitfalls. And the church's credibility has taken a serious hit in the wake of the abuse crisis. Vicar of Clergy for the Diocese of Arlington, Father PAUL SCALIA, is here to tell us what he's seeing in his diocese. We'll talk about his new book, Sermons in Times of Crisis, the World Over. Begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. WALID PHARES, Dr. GUARENDI, and Father PAUL SCALIA are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. I'll be live tweeting throughout. First, some important stories from the world over. A dozen Catholic churches have been desecrated across France over the period of a week. Last Sunday, marauders set fire to the church of Saint-Sulpice, one of Paris's largest and most important churches, shortly after the 12 o'clock Mass, causing hundreds of millions in damages. In Nimes, near the border of Spain, the church of Notre-Dame des Enfants was desecrated in a particularly odious way, with vandals painting a cross with human excrement. They stole communion hosts and tossed them into the garbage. According to reports, 80% of the desecrations in France target Christian churches. The Catholic hierarchy has kept silent about the incidents, acknowledging that only the anti-Christian threat is growing and expressing hope that police will find the perpetrators. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo returned to the Middle East this week to push for action against Iran. Pompeo began his trip in Kuwait on Tuesday and headed to Israel Wednesday. His trip will also take him to Lebanon. In Israel, Pompeo met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel has been cracking down on Iran-backed missile strikes on Tel Aviv, launched from the Golan Heights. Pompeo said that on his third stop in Beirut, the focus would be on how the U.S. can help protect Lebanon from the Iran-Hezbollah threat. The U.S. considers Hezbollah a pro-Iranian terrorist organization, though it is represented in the coalition government of Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri. Here with analysis on all of this and much more, I'm joined by national security, foreign policy expert, and former foreign policy advisor to the President, Dr. WALID PHARES. WALID, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Raymond.
Let's start with these horrific attacks in New Zealand. 50 people lost their lives. This madman goes into mosques and opens fire. He's recording it the whole time, premeditated, live streaming the whole thing. What is the lesson to be learned from this evolving terror threat that we're seeing?
It was horrible, especially that he broadcast this on social media. My first concern is the lesson that other extremists could do it from all quarters. And so we have to be very careful. When we spot an extremist, this is where we should start acting. I think New Zealand now has joined the nations who have been targeted by extremism, not just this type of extremism, but other types as well.
What does it tell us about the way it's being framed? This guy obviously claims to be a white supremacist, seems to be a white supremacist. He wrote this manifesto. He obviously wanted a lot of attention. What did New Zealand do wrong, and what can we learn from them?
Look, this reminds me of Breivik in Norway. You have all these mutation. I mean, there is an ideological debate. We have the far left, we have the far right, we have the far everything. We have the Islamist, jihadist, fascist, everything you want. That kind of terrorism backed by this ideology is a mutation that is not even accepted by the extremists. I mean, he constructed his own ideology. He has been inspired by people who wrote about that, but he created his own doctrine. And that is very serious because other cases could develop as well. What is very important, and we need to be very careful about, not to link his doctrine to mainstream religious or political movements, because that is exactly what he wants.
Now, you said on Fox News the other day that there is a relationship between Islamophobia and jihadism. Explain that, because this is being written off as an Islamophobic attack, and we have members of the Muslim community, CARE and others, saying it's coming here.
Well,
They're
of course,
feeling it here.
CARE will use any incident, any massacre to basically develop their own political agenda. There's no doubt about that. I'm not even worried about that. The public opinion knows what is the case. I would be concerned about the public opinion in the Muslim community, the silent majority. They feel insecure, but here's the explanation. Islamophobia is the irrational fear of Islam. It exists, it's in the debate. Jihadism is an ideology that wants to establish a violent caliphate, so on and so forth. Those who fear, basically, are fed by the jihadists. The jihadists are feeding that fear with the statements that they are making, with the YouTube, with the ISIS, etc. So the Islamophobe, the normal Islamophobe, are people who have an irrational fear of what the ISIS people are doing and saying. And it's also true the other way around. The jihadists, basically, the formation of those jihadists, when they see these acts of attacks against the Muslims, and they are portrayed precisely by these lobbies as anti-Islam, who is going to respond to that? The jihadists, which explains why when this happened, you had ISIS saying, oh, we will respond against that.
Right.
Who's responsible for that? Those who made this into an actual Islamophobia.
I imagine this is very similar to what we're seeing in Turkey from the president there. Tell us about how he used this tragedy to his own political advantage. Of course, he's running again, right?
Yeah, well, that was my first point.
Yeah, he's got a campaign underway.
He is running, but this is too much. This is jogging, and that would actually create problems in Turkey and the Middle East. President Erdogan sort of responded to this as if this was an attack by the Christian world in the medieval times, Crusaders against the caliphate. That is irresponsible in my view. He should actually isolate it and said this has nothing to do with the relationship between governments around the world, at least since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. He should be aware of that.
Yeah. Contrast the coverage of this with what we're seeing in Nigeria, where you have Christians slaughtered, hundreds of thousands. This gets zero coverage, no coverage, in the United States or anywhere else.
It is so bad to make the comparisons in general between violence and violence. They're all to be pushed against. I mean, if you had a tape of those jihadi attackers against those Christian villages and see, and you see basically the bloodshed, you would have a worldwide reaction. The problem is that not every single event has been covered by the media, but there is something else. In general terms, somehow mainstream media is not interested in covering persecution of Christians or Hindus or others, or moderate Muslims as well.
Right, which is another major group that's targeted routinely by the caliphate, by these ISIS fighters, and it just doesn't get covered at all.
Moderate Muslims do not count in the media.
Let's talk for a moment about China before we return to ISIS, because there's some big news I'll share with you in a moment. In China, we are seeing this ongoing persecution of Christians, churches decimated. The Vatican signed a pact with the Chinese regime. 6 months ago, they thought they'd get concessions. Doesn't seem they've gotten too many. Now, President Xi is in Rome, and the Pope has been begging him for a meeting. He's not giving him the meeting. Any idea why he wouldn't want to meet with Xi? I've read with the Pope. I've read in some reports that Xi's getting pushback for the pact, for the Vatican sign-over.
He is from inside the Communist Party ruling China, because should it be the issue of religious freedom or the issue of any other type of freedom, then China will start to change. I mean, look what happened in East Germany, what happened to the Soviet Union. They know that. So they are ready to trade with you, to cut deals on economics and everything, but not on ideas. If you tell them, give freedom to the Christian communities or even to the Muslim communities in Xinjiang.
Right, they're rounding them up and putting them in internment
That would be the beginning of the next stage that this leadership doesn't want to get to.
Let's talk about these atrocities in France. Everybody's scratching their head. You have both the officials, church officials, as well as the police saying, well, we don't have any suspects here for these church desecrations. 12 churches, altars demolished, tabernacles ripped out, burned. One of these hundreds of millions of dollars we reported on a moment ago. Who do you think and what do you think is driving this?
What I know, what we all know, what the French know, is that the French have one of the best internal security intelligence, renseignements généraux. For much lesser than that, they will get you all the information who did it. When you have 10, 12 churches, especially of these these type of churches, historical, desecrated, and then attacked, I think that at some level in France, they don't want to reveal at this point in time to the public who are the perpetrators. They think that is at a level of national security, because if they reveal it, then the French could have a reaction against the perpetrators.
And they're already having this. They're already having problems with their vested people. Yellow vests, the neon vests are already up in arms. Let's talk about Mike Pompeo in the Middle East this week. The president tweeting out just today that the Golan Heights should be in the possession of Israel. Of course, attacks were launched earlier this week, last week, from the Golan Heights. Your thoughts on what's happening there and the purpose of this trip, the importance of it?
Well, first of all, Secretary Pompeo understands very well where the threat is coming. And in our conversation, you and I, we discussed that his central attention is Iran. Wherever the Iranian regime is expanding, including north of the Golan Heights, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, in Iraq and elsewhere, this is where he's going to try to create this coalition, this Arab NATO, Middle Eastern NATO, probably a coordination between the Arabs and Israel. That's what he's trying to do. Problem is that the Iranians are all over the place. They are already, as I said, in Lebanon and in Yemen. So it's a tall order to be able to reverse what the Iranians have been trying to do for the last 5 years.
Wow. I want to play this for you. This is President Trump earlier this week holding up a map of the ISIS presence when he was elected and present day. Watch.
I brought this out for you because this is a map of everything in the red. This was on election night. In 2016, everything red is ISIS. When I took it over, it was a mess. Now, on the bottom, that's the exact same. There is no red. In fact, there's actually a tiny spot which will be gone by tonight. So that's ISIS, red right there. And the bottom one is how it is today.
Is this really the collapse of ISIS? Is that really what we're seeing here?
Look at the map of the president, and he has been in all his life a real estate strategist.
Right.
The real estate of ISIS
Is gone.
Is gone. My problem is that who is going to be the inheritant? Because this is a real estate. It's gone. Who is going to come and replace?
Because this is a battle. This is an ideology.
It's a battle of ideology.
It's not a place. It's not a state.
Yes, that's a problem. So the concern is, will a neo-ISIS come back? Will Al-Qaeda in Syria come back? Will the Turks move in? Will Assad, will the Iranian militia go in? That's the real question that we need to address.
Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, talked about some of our national security threats. She said one of the most, I guess, underviewed or ignored is cyber terrorism. Do you see that as a growing threat? And from whom would it come? China?
The capacity of those who have the weapons to attack us with cyber elements is large, and it could create havoc in this country. Yes, there is a list that the Secretary has announced, including China first, it has huge capabilities, and Russia, and North Korea, and Iran, but also private sector, all organizations and criminal organizations, they all have this capacity. But here's my answer. I think we're not prepared. We will never be prepared fully. We can't be ahead of that cyber threat. But one thing is sure. If we are attacked by a regime or a government, maybe they will cause a lot of havoc in the first strike. We will get them on the second strike. We have always the resources, and the Secretary said that. We have the intellectual and scientific resources, but we've can't
yet
always
to employ them.
Yes.
Tell me for a moment, as I watched the international news coverage this past week, the focus has been on nationalism as a threat, that this is its own ideology that must be checked and watched. In your opinion, is nationalism or jihadism the greater threat the Western world faces?
Look, I did almost a PhD dissertation back in the old days in Lebanon, master's dissertation on nationalism. People don't understand what they're talking about when they're talking about nationalism. Nationalism is embedded in every single nation around the world. Then it grows either into extreme nationalism or it shrinks into patriotism. So extreme nationalism becomes, extremism and terrorism, and we live it here, we live it in Europe. But to say that nationalism is international, by essence, nationalism cannot be international. The one that is international are the jihadists, because they want to establish a worldwide caliphate. They can coordinate among themselves. Extreme nationalists cannot coordinate among themselves. I mean, from Austria to Chile to Brazil to the Arab national, how can they coordinate? Because all what they're saying, it's about us only. So by theory, I don't think you could compare the jihadists to the nationalists.
Before I let you go, we talked about the shrinking real estate of ISIS. Where are they now? Where are these fighters now and their families?
Okay.
Are they in Syria? Are they in Iran? Where are they?
Look, first of all, when a building collapses, that's a real estate. Where do they go? Below. They are underground. And of course, underground, you don't have families, you don't have large population, you have cells. And these cells have begun to strike in Iraq and Syria. Other cells are going to try to reach the west. So crushing ISIS in Iraq and Syria may have another reaction, which is more attacks in the west. Because, as I explained it, when they had this huge land, 90% of their activities was to manage the land. Now they don't have the land.
Amazing. WALID PHARES, thank you for the insight. We'll be checking in the days ahead. You can keep up with Dr. WALID PHARES, his columns, his media appearances, by following him on Twitter at WALID PHARES, and I'll tweet his handle out so you have it. A new New York Times poll looked at over 1,500 people, ages 18 to 28, and 1,138 parents of people that age. And they found that parents don't stop handling things for their children even when they become adults. Joining us now to discuss this and more is clinical psychologist, author, and host of The Doctor Is In on EWTN Radio, Dr. Ray Guarendi. Ray, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Raymond.
Now, this poll that came out this week on the heels of this college scandal, where parents paid to have their kids' SAT scores altered or fabricated membership on sports teams in order to get into these universities, aside from the criminality, what does it tell us about parenting today? And have you seen this in your practice?
You got three factors, Raymond. At the most base level, we've given God the boot. You get God out of there, you can kind of morally do what you want. So it doesn't really matter if this is immoral. Secondly, believe it or not, you know the modal number of children in the American family? The most common number of children, Raymond, you know what that is?
1.
It is 1. That's exactly right. It is 1. So when you have 1 kid, your parenting identity, your eggs, are all in that 1-child basket. Third factor. We have convinced parents since World War II that your kid isn't going to amount to a whole lot unless he has a college education. And only recently are we starting to rethink that notion, but it's still got a grip on the American parent persona.
Now, looking at this poll by the New York Times, Dr. Raymond, I want to dig into this. Here are some of the things parents are still doing for their adult children. 74% of them are still making doctor's appointments for them. 76% reminded their adult children about deadlines they need to meet. 15% of parents with children in college either texted them or called them to wake them up because they didn't want them to miss class. And 8% said they had contacted a college professor or administrator about their child's grades if they were having difficulty. Now, what does this tell us? Who are these parents?
These are American parents, Raymond. My mother was Italian. She didn't do half that stuff for me, and she was Italian, and she was supposed to do that stuff for me. Given that, here's what's happening. Well, parents do damage control. In other words, if you raise a child spoiled, if you raise a child self-centered, they're going to make a lot of bad moves. They're going to do a lot of things that aren't going to lead to their responsibility. So the parent has to pick up the pieces, and they're still picking up the pieces when the kid's 24. Right. They're afraid.
Or 34. Look, I love this next data point, and there's so many. I could have gone on, I could do an hour on this just because these data points are unbelievable. But this one, 11% of parents with adult children will call the child's employer if he or she has an issue at work. Now, Dr. Ray, I've gone through this as a boss in the workplace, where the parent will show up at the door and say, you know, I noticed you assigned my son to this, but maybe he should have gotten this. This is mind-blowing. What's wrong with these parents, and how are these adult children accepting this? Why do they put up with it?
This is, well, first of all, Raymond, they want to put up with it. So that's not the problem there. This is a theme that starts very early. It's what I call the not my kid theme. It is, the world is wrong, not my kid. And you see this in teacher conferences. You see this with coaches. Why are you not playing my son? He's a lot better than this. He should be starting. This goes all the way up. So it's a natural progression into adulthood. I have to make sure that my kid is not mistreated because the world isn't fair to my kid. That is a devastating parenting mentality, and it starts early.
But there really is a narcissism wrapped up in it. I mean, you mentioned it earlier. The parent's whole identity is bound up usually in this one kid. So the whole family name is riding on them succeeding, getting into the college, you know, pulling down $500,000 a year. It's very important to their identity. It really isn't even about the kid.
Raymond, you know I have 10 children.
Yes.
And
See,
one of the reasons for
you
that
have
is
a wide
because
portfolio.
if I mess up on 3 of them, I still got 7 more. That's not bad. All my eggs are not in one basket. And I think that is a phenomenon among parents too. This one kid, this 2 kids is a reflection of my competence as a parent. And if this kid is doing these kinds of things as a young adult, I better fix it.
The term being used, Dr. Ray, is, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, is snowplow parents. That's what they call them because they clear any obstacle to their child's success out of the way. What are the long-term effects of this? Aren't we prolonging adolescence here?
It's like the parent whose kid throws a fit. Okay, when the child throws a fit, if the parent finds an excuse for it, if the parent takes away the supposed factors, oh, he's tired. Oh, you know, he had too many donuts. I think that's what it was. He had 2 donuts with the jelly. I think the jelly is what did it. No, he had that Kit Kat. Well, that kind of mentality heads up into adulthood, which is I've got to push out of the way any contributing factors as I see it in this kid's life. No, Raymond, I think the kids want this. They lean on it. They actually get behind that bulldozer.
Yeah, well, that's why they're in the basement playing, you know, Fortnite all day long in Mama's basement till they're 30, and you know that's their social interaction and their occupation. Playing snowplow parent advocate here for a minute, Dr. Ray. Some have told me, and I've had long conversations with these parents. They say, Raymond, this is the way it is now. I had to get them on a waiting list to get into this good nursery school because that set up the best grade school for them. And then once they got to high school, I had to help with the homework. I hired a private tutor. We have a private coach. They have piano lessons throughout the day. This is the way we have to operate in today's competitive world. You would say what to that parent?
What's more important? Do you want to raise a 1 in 100 child in grade point, a 1 in 100 child in salary, or do you want to raise a 1 in 100 child in character? Every parent, Raymond, I have ever asked that says, I want to raise a 1 in 100 child in character. They all say that. But they parent differently because they've decided that the idea of success is accomplishment. It is competence. What parents don't understand, Raymond, is without character, you're not going to have accomplishment. Not long term. It's not going to sustain itself. I had a parent who had a kid who had all kinds of pro prospects, but he was a significant behavior problem. I told them, you have to limit his games. That's the only leverage. They said, no, we can't do that. That's his life. Sure enough, he washed out of college because of his character, never played ball again.
Yeah, no, it's important, that balance. And we completely wipe off the map. That's not even a goal for these parents. The character of their child and the character that the parent is displaying to get their kid to this mythical goal. As we saw in this college scandal, they're willing to even break federal law to get Junior into that college so they feel good about themselves. It's really, something's twisted. What is missing from today's parents compared to our parents' generations? And what's the biggest problem when it comes to raising children that you see in your practice?
Self-confidence and authority is missing from parents. Now, a lot of the parents who watch your show are good people. They're trying hard to be good parents. They feel like they're going upstream in this culture. The culture is no longer on their side at all. Technologically, socially, morally, it is absolutely opposed to them. And many of them underestimate its shaping power. That's a factor. A third factor is that without God, without some moral system that you can impart to those kids, then pretty much the means justifies it. Do what you can, get what you can. Raymond, do you know the number one thing I hear from parents who come into my office with kids who are already starting to have problems? Do you know what they say? No. Well, he gets good grades. He's not on drugs. He's a good kid. That's the new moral high bar.
Yeah, yeah. He's getting good grades. A study in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, Dr. Ray, found that 63%, or there was a 63% increase in young adults between the ages of 18 and 25 reporting symptoms of depression. To what do you attribute that? Is social media to blame? Is the culture you referenced a minute ago part of the reason?
So, social media is huge, Raymond, and we're just beginning to understand it. Technology leaps ahead of parents. They can't keep up with it. So they're always lagging behind it. Even the researchers are lagging behind it, but they're starting to understand its mal-shaping influence. Another factor is that parents, by and large, don't have the authority that our parents used to have. When my dad said, Raymond, have a seat, I'll tell you when you can get up, I had a seat because I knew something would happen that I didn't want. I can't tell you, it is now a majority of parents who can't look at a child and say, you sit down, please, I'll tell you when you can get up. They can't do it. When you lose that level of parental authority and leverage, now the sky's the limit in what kind of challenging behavior you're going to get.
And where does that come from? Where did that where did the authority go, or the unwillingness to deploy it? Why? Why are we so reticent? Is it the media? Is it you can't whip your kid? Is it what is it?
Where did it go, Raymond? You're looking at it. Me, the experts. I have totally reshaped how you are to raise children. And because of that, we've stripped parents of confidence, of authority, of resolve, all of the things that they need to raise this child who is basically coming into their world asocialized, amoral, self-centered, and totally impulsive. But if you take the confidence away from parents, that we experts, we've reshaped parenting. And so many good people are feeling paralyzed by it. Yeah. If I leave him on the potty 3 minutes too long, he's going to grow up to be a tattooed-faced motorcycle gang member on acid.
Too many timeouts, and I'll ruin him. I got to talk to you about
That's
something.
it.
I did a piece the other day on Fox, and it was about this new cultural move. It was in the New York Times this past weekend. It's called Unimoons. And this is where you get rid of a honeymoon, you say I do at the altar, and the next day the newlyweds run off with their friends to separate unimoons, individual vacations. Your thought on this and what it does to a couple and their potential bond?
I've never heard about it. If I tried that with my wife, I'd have been in uni trouble. I'll tell you that right now. What you're witnessing, it's as simple as this, I think. When you get rid of the moral glue that used to hold a society together, anything goes. Anything you can conjure up that will supposedly get you to more happiness, more self-fulfillment. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing bits and pieces of nonsense, every which direction, coming from everywhere, because the traditional glue is dissolving.
No, Dr. Ray, as I thought about it, and as I talked to people yesterday, I went out on the street and talked to them. What you find is there's a selfishness among people. I mean, if you can't agree with your spouse about where you're going to go as a couple on a honeymoon, your life is over. Wait till the kids and the dogs come into the equation. You're going to slaughter each other in the kitchen. But there's an inflexibility. And part of that, I think, is narcissistic. The other part, I think, is people are waiting so much longer to get married that they're set in their ways. They're hardened. It's harder to compromise. The flexibility's gone. Do you see that in your practice? Do you see it in the parenting?
The average male now gets married close to age 30.
Wow.
All right, that is 5 years older than 1960. The average female is at age 26. 40% of 20-somethings go back home. They live back at home. Here's an interesting statistic. Of those millennials, the younger millennials, who get a job, 1/3 of them don't last 3 months.
Wow. And why is that?
Poor performance, poor performance and lack of acceptance of authority.
Because that's
if
the way
I
they
am
were
the
trained.
center of the universe, that's the way I'm trained. I tell parents, I will tell parents, you do not look at other parents to guide you. You have to look at what you want to raise. And if you want to raise a 1 in 100 kid, you'd better be a 1 in 100 parent. Because they're not going to parent like you. And you better be prepared to get grief and questioning and critiquing, because you're trying to raise an exceptional human being. And in so doing, you will depart from the general population.
Great
I know
advice.
that sounds bad, but it's reality.
No, I like reality. Dr. Ray, that we can always count on you. Thank you for being that voice of clarity and for willing to cut through so much of the static that parents and all of us encounter every day. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Raymond.
For more
Thanks,
on
Raymond.
Dr. Ray Guarendi, visit his website, drray.com. Of course, his show on EWTN. He's on EWTN Radio with the doctors in. Always worth watching and listening to. Thanks again, Dr. Ray. Father Paul Scalia is just ahead, but first, some news. On Tuesday, Pope Francis refused to accept the resignation of French Cardinal Philippe Barbarin, instead asking him to stay on, citing the presumption of innocence. A court in Lyon ruled this month that between July 2014 and June of 2015, Barbarin covered up allegations of sexual abuse, in this case of Boy Scouts in the 1980s and 90s, by a priest who is due to go to trial later this year. Barbarin is the highest profile French cleric to be caught up in the child sex abuse scandal. He was handed, rather, a 6-month suspended prison sentence by the criminal court on March 7th. He has denied the allegations and has launched an appeal. West Virginia Attorney General Patrick Morrissey sued the Catholic Diocese of Wheeling-Charleston and its former bishop, Michael Bransfield, on Tuesday. The AG is charging that the diocese knowingly employed pedophiles and failed to conduct adequate background checks for people working in Catholic schools and camps. The lawsuit is the latest civil action against the Catholic Church in the past year, alleging violations of the state's consumer protection laws. It accuses the diocese of advertising safe environments for children, while at the same time choosing to cover up and conceal arguably criminal behavior of child sexual abuse. West Virginia launched its investigation last fall after the Pennsylvania report disclosed that some accused priests had also served in West Virginia. My next guest is the Vicar of Clergy at the Diocese of Arlington here in Virginia. He'll share his thoughts on what he's seeing in his own diocese in the wake of this abuse crisis, but he's also making his own contribution to reinforce the shaken faith of Catholics with a new book, Sermons in Times of Crisis, 12 Homilies to Stir Your Soul. Welcome back to the program, Father Paul Scalia. Father, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Now, I want to start on the positive, since I have to cover all of this muck all week long. Why did you decide to put this particular collection together? It really is your thoughts, homilies, on some of the great apostles of the faith.
Sure. Well, and it's more them than me. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, the whole project began almost 2 years ago. And it was initially just going to be the greatest sermons ever preached, or sermons that changed the world.
So you were going to edit other people's sermons?
It's going to take sermons from throughout the church's history. Okay. And then, and it's interesting how things unfolded, and it became Sermons in Times of Crisis. And so each one is one of the great, preachers or orators in the church's history, applying the Word of God to some particular moment of crisis in the church. Ambrose, Augustine, Bossuet, Newman, and of course, Benedict and John Paul II. And so it came together, I think fortuitously, at this time to, can serve as an instrument to bolster people. And
I think for so many people, it's an education too. Your introductions introduce you to these people who, frankly, are names but they're lost to history and even to many Catholics.
Yeah, and one of my favorites is the one by Archbishop Bossuet, who's for the French, he's one of the greatest orators, but he's little known in English, and little known by me until fairly recently.
How did you come across him?
Christopher Bloom at the Augustine Institute has several translations of Bossuet's sermons, and they're excellent. And so I contacted him, and he was gracious enough to do the translation for this.
Wow!
And that piece is particularly interesting because Bossuet is preaching about preaching. And so it's kind of an education on how to give a homily and also how to hear a homily. Which
well,
is-
we're
which-
going to
which
talk
is
about
important.
we're going to talk about this in a moment. Particularly, there's a quote that I love that I want to get to, but I want to talk about the contemporary crisis we find ourselves in, which is a good background for what you're proposing here and this work. You're the vicar of clergy in Arlington, Virginia, a very healthy diocese. I lived there for many years. You have great priests. What are you hearing from the faithful there, and how are your priests absorbing the seeming daily shocks of this version or this iteration of the sex abuse crisis?
Well, as you said, we're blessed with a very healthy diocese and a strong bishop in Bishop Burbage, and so I think people are clearly upset, and it runs the gamut. I think as it would in most places, but and the priests are are upset too, and that runs the gamut. But I think that there's also a sense that we have to remain faithful, and that so much of the current crisis it comes from infidelity. So what's the proper response? It's one of fidelity. And it's one of continuing on that course of fidelity and courageous proclaiming of the gospel.
No, I think it's a particular hardship for priests, and at this moment when families and children and boys particularly need the formation of a healthy and strong priest, that this particular iteration of this crisis has separated, put a wall between the clergy and these families, and that to me is the most insidious form of the fallout.
Right. That's one of the sadnesses, is that everything is sort of looked at, differently and with a jaundiced eye now.
Right.
And
but this prism of dysfunction that is the result of a handful of people, but it becomes
applied to
metastasized across the entire church, and that's got to be hard.
Yeah, and absolutely. And
has it had an effect on vocations?
No.
People tell me they're up.
They're up in our diocese.
Now, to what do you attribute that? I mean, if I'm a young guy,
I like to attribute to, well, I think first of all,
the Holy Spirit.
Well, he probably has something to do with it. I think a lot of it has to do with our presbyterate, the priests in our diocese, and our bishop's leadership. I think that, to me, those are the two sort of human
they see the examples.
Causes. I think they see the example,
priest,
and I think there's also a good, healthy instinct of, well, gosh, here's a crisis. I want to be of assistance. That's something I think that's a good manly response. If the nation is at war, I want to sign up.
Right.
If the church is in trouble, I want to be of assistance here. I want to help.
Yeah, no, you see that with converts too, who I've spoken to recently, and they also, they want to dive in. And
I spoke with a convert last summer, right as all of this was coming out, and I asked him why he wanted to become Catholic. And he said, because the Catholic Church is the only institution with the integrity to address all of the problems in the world. And I was kind of surprised, and I asked him if he read the news. And he chuckled. And he said, "Yes." He said, "Father, this is a moral problem. One generation of holy priests will get rid of it." And I that was such a beautiful line, from a convert, just seeing that what's needed here. What's the solution?
Yeah.
Holy priests.
Yeah, and you see the wrestling. I mean, it's the lay people, the priests. You see parishes contending with this, but at least we're asking the right questions now. There are other communions, and we've seen these stories in the front of papers. They're having similar problems among their pastors, and their response is no response. That's a problem.
Well, absolutely, and in a sense, in God's providence, we're sort of the leading edge in addressing this.
Yeah.
There was a piece on Cook County Public Schools, and the problems there. So not even
the
a religious
Baptist
institution.
Convention. A lot of faiths are having this, sadly, ripple through it. But it's evil. It's evil, and the mystery of evil, and how to contend with it. And as you said, morality is at the heart of it. I want to read something to you. German Cardinal Reinhard Marx announced that the Catholic Church in Germany is embarking on what it's calling a binding synodal process to tackle what he says are the three key issues arising from the clerical abuse crisis: priestly celibacy, the Church's teaching on sexual morality, and a reduction of clerical power. He went on to say this: the German bishops appreciate priestly celibacy as an expression of the religious bond to God, but do not simply want to give up on it. But to what extent celibacy should always be an element of priestly witness is a question we will determine through the synodal process. Your thoughts on that idea and this focus on priestly celibacy and church teaching as a cause of the crisis?
Well, the church has always spoken of celibacy as a gift, not as a burden, not as an imposition, as a gift and as a charism. And blaming celibacy for this is like blaming marriage for adultery. You know, just it's not the problem. It's really the solution. The healthy living out of celibacy is a solution. And celibacy remains one of the greatest evangelical elements of the priesthood because it catches people's attention and it shocks them to realize that we're not meant to live just for this world.
Right.
Celibacy points us to heaven where there is no marriage, and catches people's attention in that way. And so I think we need to recover the gift, not downplay it.
What are the elements of celibacy that people miss? In the popular conception of this, on the front page of papers, even at this moment, what the story the laity get is these guys are repressed.
Right.
They don't have an outlet for what's natural, and that is the reason that we're seeing all these behaviors all over the church.
Right. And I think that's kind of a low view of marriage, first of all, to say, well, gosh, only if he had this outlet. I mean, that's not a lofty view of marriage, is it? No. Celibacy cannot be viewed in isolation. So one of the things that we have to recognize is that celibacy needs always to be viewed in combination with poverty and obedience, right? Poverty, chastity, and obedience. In this case, celibate chastity. And so I think one of the things that has come out in the past 9 months is there can be an indulgent lifestyle, right?
Right.
And there can be disobedience, and these are other factors.
And they're all tied together.
They're always tied together. They're always tied together, and so I think for among priests, this is a call to a greater simplicity of life, a greater fidelity or obedience. And these are necessary supports also for celibacy. Another factor that I think people skip over is that celibacy is supposed to be an asceticism. It is supposed to be a sacrifice. It is the sacrifice of Good Friday that produces the resurrection of Easter Sunday. That's how we should view it. It's not just that his dying was the necessary precondition. Right. The sowing of his body in the earth brings about the resurrection. Right. And that's what we believe about sacrifice. The sacrifice, whether it's simplicity of life, which is the sacrifice of your goods, the obedience, which is a sacrifice of your will, or celibate chastity, which is a sacrifice of your body.
Well, and giving yourself fully to your flock and to souls.
Well, and so there will be, for a man at times, there will be loneliness. In our culture, celibate men are not the only lonely people, right? Yeah. But the whole purpose of this is to experience that sacrifice and go to the Lord with it. That's the purpose of it.
Yeah.
It's like not fasting because, well, it makes me hungry. Well, that's the whole purpose, right?
It's supposed to make you hungry.
I think,
and it's about conquering the self and offering the self.
Yes, exactly. Self-possession for the purpose of self-gift. That's it. And I think also we forget about spiritual fatherhood,
right?
And this is really ultimately the purpose of celibacy. And St. Paul says to the Corinthians, I became your father through the gospel. It is his ministry by proclaiming the gospel, by administering the sacraments, that he becomes a spiritual father to them. Yeah. And so it is fitting that of course, he has no other children and he has no wife. He's entirely given for them.
Now, Billy Graham had that great line in his memoir about, this is an area where the Catholics may have it right, he said, because I always felt the division in myself between my family, my earthly family, my blood family, and my spiritual family.
Right.
That he always felt that division.
Well, and it's not as though we have a healthy view of marriage right now. Our view of marriage is very poor right now. And the sacrifice that it takes to really be a faithful priest is going to draw away from wife and family. Yeah. That's not fair to them.
Yeah. Moving on to the book, Sermons in Times of Crisis, I want to read this little bit from your introduction and get your response to it. The preacher of the gospel is the Christian prophet par excellence. Like the prophets of old, he must be rooted in the past that is his in the Church's scriptures, traditions, and liturgy. But if he always seeks to be contemporary and relevant, he will soon find himself dated and irrelevant. Do you see that pattern?
I think this is something that's always haunted the preacher. And I think, and the prophets of ancient Israel. I think there is always the temptation to play to the crowd. And this is one of the temptations that our Lord, that the devil puts before our Lord in the desert, right? It's throw yourself from the pinnacle of the temple, and you'll amaze everybody. They'll really like you.
And it's one. I mean, you do see people falling prey to it all the time.
Absolutely.
Where we talk about a piece of legislation, or we talk about the environment or something.
There's always that temptation, and the point I was making in that part is that we usually think of the prophets as predicting the future.
Right.
The prophets of ancient Israel were actually more rooted in the past. They were there to bear witness to the covenant. That was really their role. That was their purpose. And so I think that's for the preacher today, or the prophet in the pulpit today, he has to be so rooted in the church's tradition, in her teachings, in her liturgy. He really has to dwell within the church. And then he can speak authentically to people.
Yeah, and to be that prophetic voice.
And to be that prophetic voice, and to discern the signs of the times, and to be able to see what is going on in our culture. Why is it that Paul VI was able to foresee the results of artificial contraception? It's not because he was a fortune teller or anything.
Yeah.
It's because he was rooted in the church's teachings, and because of that, he could see how things.
Which is rooted in an understanding of nature and man
and of the person.
I mean, it's all. I mean, I love the idea that when you just said the Old Testament prophets, they were testifying to the past, a reminder of that covenant. It really is the same thing today. We as a culture have so forgotten the past, and even the recent past. So it becomes more incumbent upon you to bring that tradition and the understanding, and
makes us look even weirder.
Well, but it's really the only hour that people have to reflect.
Absolutely. But this is true in the secular world too. We're not allowed to have any heroes from the past in the secular world, in our nation, for example. Those are being toppled.
Right.
And so there really is kind of a spirit of just casting off the past. And the church stands and serves as a voice, giving voice to the covenant from the past,
right,
and most of all to our Lord's passion, death, and resurrection.
There are 12 homilies in this book. How were they chosen? Did you write them for this? Were they?
They're not my homilies.
The introductions are yours, but I mean, you chose these homilies how?
Well, historically, wanted just a sampling from major segments in the church's history.
Okay.
And then chose them to, a time of crisis. In other words, if they were just great homilies, Augustine would probably dominate, right? Yeah. But we wanted a homily that was in a specific situation, and it was the preacher bringing the Word of God to bear in a specific situation and addressing that moment. And like John Paul II in Warsaw. I mean, just phenomenal. Or Pope Benedict, prior to the conclave.
When people read this, what do you want them to come away with? And it's a slim volume. It's not a. This isn't a heavy lift. You can read this on a plane.
Right. Well,
no, you can. Well, there and back. Okay, I'll give you a little 2 plane rides.
I mean, I think the sermons themselves are edifying. I hope it also gives a better devotion just to the Word of God, and an appreciation for how the Word of God needs to be applied and sort of to be enfleshed in every moment. Right? It's not the Word of God is not chained, St. Paul says, and so we want it to have life, and for them to pray for their priests.
Well, that's important.
That they preach well.
And I love that you remind us of these great heroic men of God and virtue who did sort of stand, in the gap of their own times, because so many of these figures are forgotten. I mean, we know Augustine, even John Paul II. So many have no frame of reference.
Well, we're hitting that period now where the kids in school, they have no idea who he was.
No idea. He's a picture on the wall,
as Chesterton says, he's too recent to be history, too late to be news.
To be news. Father Paul Scalia, thank you for
Good
being
to see
here.
you.
The
Thank
book
you.
is Sermons in Times of Crisis, 12 Homilies to Stir Your Soul. by Father Paul Scalia. It's available at bookstores everywhere and online. Before we go, I have some amazing pictures to share with you. Look at these. These are from Will Wilder 3 readers. Now, I have to tell you, nothing makes my day more than seeing these kids and families reading the Will Wilder series together. I'm also extending my Will Wilder, The Amulet of Power audiobook giveaway for one more week. Send your pictures to Raymond at raymondarroyo.com, and I'll choose my favorites and might send you an unabridged new audiobook. It also makes an incredible Easter gift for the young adventurer in your life and the slightly older adventurer. Also, next week is the 3rd anniversary of dear Mother Angelica's passing, which I can hardly believe. The entire Mother Angelica collection, the biography, the sequel to the biography, and the 3 collections I edited for her are available at bookstores everywhere. It's a great read, particularly this time of year. That is all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, you can follow me on Twitter. The links are at raymondarroyo.com. Until next week, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. I know.